Hello, everyone. As we go along, you'll see some screenshots of Ferdinand Lopez and a few key characters in the 1974 Pallisers television series, plus portraits of American Gilded Age scoundrels, as well as contemporary political cartoons lambasting those rascals, all in Google. And you'll hear some impressions from Victoria Glendenning's Whitbread Prize-winning biography of Trollope. And now I'll move over to the pictures. It was clear from the start that the up-and-coming financier Ferdinand Lopez, a young, attractive, well-mannered man about town, sure to be seen at the best parties and dinners, was to be the villain as he plotted and schemed to acquire wealth and self-promotion. And here's Lady Glencora. Early in the book, Trollope tells us that, quote, Ferdinand Lopez was employed, or at least had been employed, on business which does not of itself give such a warrant of position as is supposed to be afforded by the bar and the church, by the military services, and by physic. He had been on the stock exchange. To Trollope, the stock exchange resembled a kind of betting parlor, and still in some manner not clearly understood by his friends, did business in the city, end quote. And several chapters later, we learn about investments in 2 or 3 American mines. And Lady Glen and Ferdinand Lopez. By the time of our reading assignment, Ferdinand is telling Lady Glencora, I've got into another groove. I've become essentially a city man, one of those who take up the trade of making money generally. I have always regarded myself as the architect of my own fortune. John Ruskin said, the first of all English games is making money. That is an all-absorbing game, and we knock each other down oftener at playing that than at playing football or any other roughest sport. And it is absolutely without purpose. No one who engages heartily in that game ever knows why. Lady Glen with the Prime Minister and Mrs. Finn. When Ferdinand's very good friend Everett Wharton, the son of a wealthy barrister, insults him, we learn that Ferdinand had borne with Everett's unpleasantness, quote, as an angel would hardly have done, but should Wharton ever stand in his friend's way, his friend would sacrifice him without compunction, end quote. And Ferdinand and Sextus Parker. Trollope tells us Ferdinand Lopez was not an honest man or a good man. We already know that he exploited and cheated his business partner, Sextus Parker. He was a self-seeking, intriguing adventurer who did not know honesty from dishonesty when he saw them together. He was willing to cheat all the world so that he might succeed and make a fortune and become a big and rich man. To his own way of thinking, that which we call cheating was not dishonesty. To his thinking, there was something bold, grand, picturesque, and almost beautiful in the battle which such a one as himself must wage with the world before he could make his way up in it. He would not pick a pocket or turn a false card or, as he thought, forge a name. That which he did and desired to do took with him the name of speculation. When he had persuaded poor Sexty Parker to hazard his all, knowing well that he induced the unfortunate man to believe what was false and to trust what was utterly untrustworthy, he did not himself think that he was going beyond the lines of fair enterprise, end quote. And Lady Glen and the Duke of St. Bungay. Ferdinand defines his business practices as speculation, describing society at large as not having caught up to his manner of doing business based on contingency. I buy and sell on speculation. The world, which is shy of new words, has not yet given it a name. If I buy a ton of coffee and keep it 6 weeks, why do I buy it and keep it? And why does the seller sell it instead of keeping it? The seller sells it because he thinks he can do best by parting with it now at a certain price. I buy it because I think I can make money by keeping it. It is just the same as though we were to back our opinions. He backs the fall, I back the rise. I make it my study to watch the markets, but I needn't buy everything I see in order to make money by my labor and intelligence. And Ferdinand and Emily Wharton. Ferdinand's entire life, professional and personal, is based on chance. He was able to marry Emily, the wealthy barrister's daughter, when he saved her brother Everett's life, and her father reluctantly consented to the marriage. Ferdinand married Emily for love and money. Then his corrupt campaign escalated. During their honeymoon, he convinced Emily to request significant sums of money from his father-in-law to fund his investments. He even describes his business dealings as based in chance, saying, for example, that he raised money when the chance came in my way. Some diligent researcher determined that the word chance appears 39 times in the Prime Minister, and most of the time it refers to Ferdinand Lopez. This speculative mode is abhorred by the landed gentry he is married into. Emily's family preferred the solid basis of land, investment, and the slow accumulation of savings. But for Ferdinand, the old-fashioned way to build wealth is not rapid enough for an individual to rise socially. In the first paragraphs in chapter 25, the beginning of the honeymoon, we learn that Ferdinand had, as a first resolution, promised himself a fortnight's freedom from all cares. His second resolution had been that at the end of the fortnight, he would commence his operations on his father-in-law, and then his third resolution had reference to his wife. She must be instructed in his ways. She must learn to look at the world with his eyes. She must be taught the great importance of money, not in a griping, hard-fisted, prosaic spirit, but that she might participate in that feeling of his own which had in it so much that was grand, so much that was delightful, so much that was picturesque. He would never ask her to be parsimonious, never even to be economical, but she must learn that the enjoyment of these things must be built upon a conviction that the most important pursuit in the world was the acquiring of money. He had perceived that she had much influence with her father, and she must be taught to use this influence unscrupulously on her husband's behalf, end quote. There is a quote, now another quote, there is a relation between romance and finance in the Prime Minister. Their terms are interchangeable if feeling is a form of currency and speculating with love is analogous with speculating with money. If Emily's feeling for Ferdinand is understood as the characteristic attitude of the speculator, then she must therefore be taught to invest her emotions as she would her money wisely. The marriage plot is the financial plot. The lesson Emily learns about Ferdinand is taught by way of her increasing knowledge of his financial dealings. Trollope says one can read a man's character in the way he manages his money. Ferdinand's value or his lack of value emerges through examples of the kind of character he is. Is he an investor or is he a speculator? End quote. And here's Ferdinand. Trollope says, to tell the truth of him, though he was not absolutely penniless, he was altogether propertyless. He had been speculating in money without capital, and though he had been now and again successful, he had also now and again failed. Thanks to my resident classical scholar, the Latin quotation early in chapter 25 is from Horace's Odes, Book 3. Black care sits behind the rider. Dark anxiety pursues the horseman. The quote in Latin would have been familiar to Trollope because of his classical education at Harrow, and it would be known to Victorians generally because of its use in a Thackeray novel decades before. Quote, thus was Ferdinand Lopez mounted high on his horse, for he has triumphed greatly in his marriage, but the inky devil sat close on his shoulders, end quote. I'm very grateful to Ginny for her wonderful introduction to the first 14 chapters that set up contrasts between pairs of characters in the Prime Minister, Ferdinand and Everett, Plantagenet and Mr. Wharton, Lady Glen and Mrs. Roby. I'd like to present another pairing, an American parallel with Trollope's Scoundrel. The American version is the Gilded Age's robber barons, America's most successful industrialists. As Nick Burns said to me, the only difference with the robber barons is that Ferdinand Lopez cared a lot more about being a gentleman than they did. Nicholas Burns and John Werenius edited the companion to Trollope, and they gave a talk at the Trollope Society a few years ago, celebrating Trollope's life, works, and adventures. The derogatory term robber baron was originally applied to noblemen in the Middle Ages who functioned as feudal warlords and robbed travelers, often merchant ships along the Rhine River, and were literally robber barons. In the 1870s, the term began to be used to describe business tycoons. Those rascals are populating Julian Fellowes' popular and well-researched television historical drama series set in 1880s America, The Gilded Age, which recently signed up for a third season. Julian Fellowes immersed himself in novels by Edith Wharton and Henry James for plot lines and period accuracy. Samuel Clemens, known as Mark Twain, first used that term in a novel called The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, and he satirized greed and political corruption in post-Civil War America. It was published in 1873, roughly contemporaneous with The Prime Minister, which was published between 1875 and 1876 as a standalone weekly serial rather than as part of a magazine, and published as a book in 1876. The Civil War timing is key because the American titans of industry rose during and after the war between the states, 1861 to 1865. Coincidentally, this happens to be a day when American children have a holiday from school, a national day of remembrance honoring the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Trollope's first visit to America was in 1862, and he wrote about the Civil War, which he called the War of Secession, in Dr. Wortle's School, a travel book, and Christmas Stories, among other writings. The urge to unify the country after the Civil War unleashed a plan to transfer billions of acres of public land to the emerging groups of large-scale private enterprise, which was given the power and authority to extend the railroads that had been used for troop shipments during the war or build new ones. The transcontinental railroads required the energies of a generation to create capital, banks, mines, technical knowledge, a mechanical population, and a generation of leaders was ready. During the Civil War, men who evaded military service by paying the legally allowed fee to purchase a substitute soldier aligned with unscrupulous manufacturers and got their start up the economic ladder and made handsome profits by providing war materials. They sold the federal government rancid meat, moth-eaten blankets, defective rifles that didn't shoot. Quote, for sugar, the government often got sand. For coffee, rye. For leather, something no better than brown paper. For sound horses and mules, spavined beasts and dying donkeys. A quote from Harper's Monthly in 1864. Synchronicity is at work here. These American captains of industry were roughly the same age as Trollope's Ferdinand Lopez, who is 33 years old when we first meet him in 1876 when the book was published. The Americans were contemporaries close in age, all born in the 1830s. Morgan, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Fisk, Armour, Gould, Hill, and Villard became robber barons during the Civil War and battled the older generation of robber barons, Vanderbilt, Drew, Huntington, Crocker, Hopkins, and Stanford, for control of various enterprises. They received privileged access and financing from the government with monopolistic special licenses, per-mile subsidies, huge land grants, and low-interest loans. Unimpeded by income taxes, organized labor movements, reform activity, or anti-monopoly laws, that generation that developed the transportation, communications, and industrial sector after 1865 found themselves lords of empires held for personal gain and defended them to the last breath of financial life against all comers. Now let's take a look at a few of those robber barons. Jay Gould was a railroad tycoon born in 1836. Through clever financial maneuvers, he gained control of 1 mile of every 6 miles of the country's rapidly expanding network of railroad tracks. By 1881, Gould owned 15% of the U.S. railroad system. Jay Gould is one of the models for the robber barons in the Gilded Age TV series. Full disclosure, my husband and I visited Lyndhurst, a house museum, Jay Gould's estate on the Hudson River, with my friend who is a descendant of Jay Gould, and I promised her that I would rehabilitate his reputation. And sure enough, Gould's daughter Helen was a philanthropist. Our next scoundrel is James Fisk. He was born in 1835. His early work history is quite colorful and includes a stint in the circus, as well as work as a waiter, peddler, and salesman. In Washington, D.C., he did very well with Army contracts during the Civil War and later became a stockbroker. It was about this time that he crossed paths with Jay Gould. Their earliest collaboration involved the Erie Railroad. Much of Erie's stock was owned by Cornelius Vanderbilt, and to supplant Vanderbilt, they issued fraudulent stock in the company in an effort to weaken it and weaken Vanderbilt's position. This fight over control of the railroad was messy, but eventually Vanderbilt ceded control of the railroad to Gould and Fisk. John D. Rockefeller was born in 1839. He founded Standard Oil in 1870. He was 31 years old and bought up most of the oil refineries in the U.S. when oil was used for lamps as well as fuel for ships and cars, and eventually controlled about 90% of the U.S. oil production. Rockefeller's monopoly power and business practices came under criticism, particularly in the writings of the muckraking author Ida Tarbell. As a young girl, she lived in the birthplace of the American oil industry, Titusville, Pennsylvania. And in 1911, the Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil must be dismantled for violation of the federal antitrust laws of 1890. It was broken up into 34 separate entities, which included companies that became Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, and others. As a result, Rockefeller became the country's first billionaire with a fortune worth nearly 2% of the national economy. In his retirement, he focused his energy and wealth on philanthropy, especially in the areas of biomedical research, medical training, higher education, and educational opportunities for disadvantaged minorities. Charles Tyson Yerkes was born in 1837. His private bank in Philadelphia earned him his first millions. He moved to Chicago and became a streetcar tycoon by deceiving, deluding, and outsmarting his opposition, and built the Loop, the city's cable car and elevated rail line. Then he went to London and built the Bakerloo, Northern, and Piccadilly lines there. He was not averse to using bribery and blackmail to obtain his ends, and managed to thwart an attempt by Pierpont Morgan to enter the London Underground Railway field. In an effort to improve his public image, Yerkes financed an observatory for the University of Chicago. He moved to New York City and filled his brownstone mansion on Fifth Avenue with fabulous artwork in an unsuccessful attempt to socialize with the Vanderbilts, who attended the auction in his house when he died in 1905. From 1870 to 1916, a reform movement arose, and American writers and journalists crusaded against corrupt robber barons. Circling back to Trollope, 19th century society was grappling with the consequences of rapid change and economic upheaval, and Trollope made art from contemporary financial shenanigans with keen observations and rich characterizations. The American novelist Theodore Dreiser wrote books that made it easy for laymen to understand the machinations of big business. The Financier, The Titan, and The Stoic, an epic series about the rise and fall of one of those captains of industry, a fictional robber baron that the Russian oligarchs used as their model of corruption. Dreiser's anti-hero, Frank Algernon Cooperwood, was closely based on Charles Tyson Yerkes, and Trilogy of Desire was based on Yerkes' life. The books were published in 1912, 1914, and posthumously in 1947. The Stoic was completed by Dreiser's wife. In 1854, when Cooperwood was 17, he began working in Philadelphia like Yerkes. Quote, "Many of the things that we and he knew later were not then in existence. The telegraph, telephone, express company, ocean steamer, city delivery of mails. There were no postage stamps or registered letters. The streetcar had not arrived. In its place were hosts of omnibuses, and for longer travel, the slowly developing railroad system, still largely connected by canals." That's a quote from the opening paragraph of the first volume, The Financier. In spite of his young age, Cooperwood marries an affluent widow and starts embezzling municipal funds. In 1871, the Great Chicago Fire results in a national stock market crash, causing him to be bankrupt and exposed. He can't avoid being sentenced to jail because politicians use their influence to use him as a scapegoat for their own corrupt practices. Sometime after being released from jail, he invests in stocks and becomes a millionaire again. He decides to move out of Philadelphia and start a new life in Chicago. And that's only the first volume of the trilogy. Theodore Dreiser was the most popular 20th century American novelist in Russia after World War II, and his trilogy taught the oligarchs everything they needed to know about financial manipulation. In the final chapter of his autobiography, Trollope wrote about the wickedness of the world in a lighthearted though serious way. Quote, "There can be no doubt that men have become less cruel, less violent, less selfish, less brutal, but have they become less honest? The bleak outlook of those who say we are all going straight away to darkness and the dogs is contrary to the convictions of men who cannot but see how comfort has been increased, how health has been improved, and education extended," end quote. And Trollope's warm optimism prevails. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you. Thank you.